Last session we had a very broad canvas to paint upon. Now we're going to narrow things down quite considerably, and we're going to focus in both papers on data derived from our What Middletown Read project. So we're looking at Muncie, Indiana over about an 11-year period. Our moderator and commentator is Christopher Phillips, who's also involved in a database project of his own, so he's well prepared for this conversation. So, and I'll let you go from there. So.
All right. Well, thanks, Jim. And I am very glad to introduce our two panelists this morning. We've been already talking a lot about cosmopolitanism, and this is going to send us, I think, in some really interesting new directions. On the far end of the table here is Lynne Tatlock, who is a professor in the German department at Washington University of St. Louis. And she is drawing in part from her recent book, just came out last year from the Ohio State University Press, German Writing, American Reading, Women and the Import of Fiction, 1866 to 1917. Other titles that she's published among several is Publishing Culture and Reading Nation, German Book History in the Long 19th Century, that's 2010, and German Culture in 19th Century America from 2005, co-edited with Matt Erlin. So this direction of the history of reading that Lynne has really brought to the forefront of not only German studies, but the connections between German and American studies is something I'm particularly interested in here. And on the near end to me, Frank Felsenstein is a professor of English here at Ball State University with a joint position in the Honors College. He asked me to introduce him as a member of the home team, as with Jim Connolly, one of the directors of the What Middletown Read project, and very much invested in both the development of that resource, but also the interpretation of it, as will become clear in a few minutes. He's presently teaching courses on topics such as the history of the book. He has a really interesting title here, From Gutenberg to Google, What Kind of Future for the Book? And they're using the database as part of the coursework for that. He's also recently published an edition with Broadview of Tobias Smollett's Travels Through France and Italy. He's published 2 books with the Johns Hopkins University Press, dear to my heart. They're also my publisher, English Trader, Indian Maid, Representing Gender, Race, and Slavery in the New World, and Anti-Semitic Stereotypes, A Paradigm of Otherness in English Popular Culture, 1660 to 1830. And his most recent exotic topic, he has just completed a manuscript with Jim Connolly titled What Middletown Read, Print Culture and Cosmopolitanism in an American Small City. And I'm Chris Phillips from Lafayette College, but I'll say a little bit more about what I do when we get to the commentary.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's been a real pleasure meeting many of you, some of whom I know virtually or through your books, and it's nice also first-time meetings as well. I have an introduction to make as well, and that's Steve Pentecost, who, to use Julianne's title is my computer guy. I think that's what you called Mark Reed, yes? But Steve's been much more than that. We started working together about 3 years ago through the Humanities Digital Workshop, and it started because I was getting so much data I couldn't manage it anymore. This is definitely not what I was trained to do. I'm a close reader. I'm a literary person, and so Steve started helping me with that along with student teams and just gathering data and entering it into data banks. And then when my book was just between copy editing and proofs, the Muncie site went live. So at the very last minute, I managed to pour a little bit of information into the book, but there was so much left unexamined. So what I'm presenting today is sort of after the book, stuff I found out later through this particular site. And Steve has worked a lot with this information, and I'm going to show you some screenshots from some of the material that he's created, but I'm hoping that in the question period we'll have a chance to look at some of the things live, because they're interactive, and you don't get the full impression when you just see this kind of dead image up there. So also when we get to anything complicated about technology or algorithms or whatever, I'm going to defer to Steve, who can explain where I can't really. So thank you for coming, Steve. It's been just such a pleasure working with you. So in the interest of time, I'm going to read my comments. That'll keep me from free associating, and which I'm wont to do. I have a lot of information, but I'm paring it down to about 5.5 pages here. So my title is The Traffic in Happy Endings, What German Books Middletown Read and Why It Mattered. I'm not sure that I've really answered the question why it mattered, but I've tried to think about it at least. From 1868 to 1917, a group of German novels in translation offered ordinary Americans, especially women, reading material that promoted associations of Germany with domestic happiness and wishes granted especially to those living in the so-called hometowns in the German regions distant from modern urban life. Americans could take them up in anticipation of optimistic stories of redemption, virtue rewarded, and deep happiness founded in intimate heterosexual bonding and concomitant social renewal, that is, happiness in marriage. Though this fiction was first written in Germany for magazines promoting German national production, it proved to be easily assimilable in the American context and crossed language barriers easily. My paper offers evidence for the kinds of readers the American publishers of these novels targeted and for historical reading of these books. Especially transaction data from Muncie make visible the ordinary readers who read these books and allow speculation as to why readers read them in the American provinces. In the aggregate, the approximately 200 translations of approximately 100 novels by approximately 20 novels proliferated in America in multiple editions and reprint editions that amounted to hundreds of thousands of books. As the translations and editions accumulated, the vogue reached its peak around 1900. Oops. As light, wholesome reading, translated German domestic fiction belonged to Americans' eclectic reading, enjoyed side by side with ephemeral fiction and novels now considered literary classics. It became standard, reliable, and popular American reading, enjoyed, recommended, and even esteemed up to the First World War. Especially Annesley Wister, the translator of popular books from the German for Lippincott, became a household word associated with good reads from Germany. While some German cultural pundits objected to the popularity of this fiction, in retaining the romantic glow absent from the realism of England and France, it in fact transmitted congenial images of Germany and German writing that may have increased Germany's esteem as a country whose values harmonized with Americans' own. Indeed, these novels project not images of militarism and aggression, as you might think in this period, pondering, philosophizing, or frightening modernity or urbanity, but rather of Germany as a land of enduring middle-class virtues and values, one of warm sentiment that allowed for the possibility of domestic bliss, a modicum of female agency, and happy endings. In producing these books, American publishers created a German import that brought to its American fans felicity based in domesticity, social justice, and social obligation, and thus also inadvertently brought Germany nearer to these Americans' wishes for their own lives. Abundant evidence exists for the enduring popularity of this translated German domestic fiction well into the new century. But while the numbers of editions and library catalogs do provide an indication of publishers' cultivation of purchasers and librarians' sense of the preferences and needs of their patrons, the library catalogs, book covers, and series themselves do not tell us who actually read these translated German novels and how they figured in long-term taste formation. In search of this information, I turned to three sources: exemplars of books, a list of most saleable books from 1876, and a decade of circulation records from the Public Library of Muncie. For the purposes of this brief overview, I'll focus principally on the Muncie records, since these data paint a picture of provincial reading of these books. The 8 years of transaction records from Muncie in the years 1891 to 1902, there's a hiatus in the data, coinciding with the peak years of the vogue of German domestic fiction, confirm American liking for these romances and the lack of interest in more pretentious German language literature. The German female author E. Marlitt, also known as Eugenia John, in fact ranks 10th of all authors read in the library, and in the aggregate, the 45 books in my set account for nearly 2% of all transactions in those years. Most of the most borrowed translations had been translated 20 years earlier, and more by the time the Muncie patrons borrowed them, corroborating Christine Pauly's findings about belated reading in her study of the Sage Library in Osage, Iowa in the same period, namely that the most borrowed titles were often not new, but were once bestsellers from 2 to 4 decades earlier. Marlitt's 3 top circulating novels together log on average 91 transactions per year. 490 of these transactions are tied to identifiably female patrons with a median age of 22, 22, and 25 respectively. Furthermore, in the aggregate, the 28 exemplars of Wister's translations logged 2,809 transactions. These numbers rival the 2,985 transactions recorded for the 40 books by the 7th most read author, Louisa May Alcott. Were Wister categorized as an author, she would, with her popular works from the German, rank ahead of Marlitt, immediately following Alcott in position 8. The Muncie records thus provide evidence that Lippincott's strategy of marketing Wister's translations in the aggregate as popular works from the German translated by Mrs. A. L. Wister, in other words, Wister got the status of an author, had succeeded. Her selections were branded as German and as guaranteeing stories Americans liked, wholesome fiction set in the German provinces with drama and a bit of adventure within the constraints of domesticity, mostly inside a single house, and most important, happy endings. These happy endings offered hope and an idea of futurity, the troubled past having been put to rest, lovers and spouses united, and the wrong compensated. Market basket analysis of the Muncie data by book and author provide clues, furthermore, as to how Marlitt's novels figured among other favorite reading in the library. The most read authors sort into roughly 3 groups, according to overlap in readership, as indicated by library transactions. In Figure 4, the dense cluster on the upper right, hope I got that right, yes. No, that's your left, is it? Wait, that's right. Okay, thank you. Stage right, stage left, okay. All right, I did think this through, but then it's panic sitting in front of you. Okay, so on the upper right is formed by the choices of mostly male patrons who preferred books by Horatio Alger and related authors. The cluster in the lower right comprises books by Alcott and similar authors for girls, as preferred by mostly female patrons. The diffuse because it includes more authors and less overlap. Left-hand cluster includes all of Wister's translations and all other translations of the same German authors, as well as such authors as Bronte, Evans, Alexander, Rowe, Holmes, Reed, Burnett, Tarkington, James, and Oliphant, as well as by the German language authors Heimburg, Werner, Streckfuss, and Schubin, all translated by Wister. These borrowers were more likely female than male. The median age of those who borrowed books in each cluster is 14, 14, and 24, respectively. So 24 is for this diffuse group. As affinity analysis further indicates, many patrons who checked out authors belonging to the 3rd cluster likely had read at least one of the German novels in translation. In the longer version of this paper, I turn to the reading of Jane Eyre, an American market leader from 20 years earlier, to which Marlitt's most popular novels also have a documented affinity. I propose that though Bronte's novel had not retained the avid interest of ordinary readers in Muncie according to these data, it lived on there in its German avatars, which were read by demographically similar readers. So actually, I think that's better. So the small dot is Bronte and the large red one is Marlitt around it. In other words, Bronte's 50-year-old novel enjoyed an afterlife in the public library as favorite leisure time reading, not so much in its own skin as in that of its younger avatars. Readers seeking foreign settings, happy endings, mystery drama, and adventure framed by domesticity, with romance culminating in marriage, could find those elements in the much shorter German novels, and the German novels are about half as long as Jane Eyre. In short, the taste formation fueled mid-century by the international success of Jane Eyre persisted half a century later in Muncie. The pleasure of happy outcomes and wrongs righted was critical to the popularity of German domestic fiction. Among the nearly 100 books translated, only a small handful does not end with marriage or reconciliation within marriage. And I should say I read about 40 of them, and then we crowdsourced the endings of final chapters with some students, so we did sort of verify that they do have happy endings. Those that did not are noticeably absent in Muncie. As the reading denizens of Muncie, perhaps some of the same borrowers who had checked out the German books 20 years earlier told the sociologists Robert S. Lynne and Helen Merrill Lynne in the 1920s, they sought happy endings in their reading since, quote, "There's enough trouble in the world all about one, so why should one have to put it in books?" End quote. In the 1920s, as the Lynns report, the denizens of Muncie read magazines, quote, "for the vicarious living and fiction form they contain," with reading centering on the idea of romance underlying the institution of marriage, end quote. That is, for the same purposes, contents, and frames as those offered 20 years before by German domestic fiction. Given such reading disposition, American provincial readers could presumably easily absorb the narrative elements of the German brand of domestic romance as pleasurably alienated versions of the norms to which they themselves were attached by virtue of their social and psychological positioning. They thus read a set of novels that delivered favorable images of Germany as a culture sharing the domestic values that shaped life in the province. Or in other words, in these popular German novels, Germany functioned as the land of wish fulfillment, possibility, and excitement within the domestic spheres for readers who supposedly already dwelled in the so-called land of unlimited opportunity, but actually lived life within narrow parameters dictated by class, age, gender, and provinciality. American reviewers who praised the ever-growing stock of German novels in translation for their, quote, peculiar tinge of romance, end quote, did not worry about the verisimilitude or historicity of these novels, but rather their emotional effects. Such novels set in far-off Germany offered American readings, including Carrie Burt, who read 7 of these novels, as well as Jane Eyre, the pleasant possibility of suspending more rigorous expectations of social and psychological realism while affirming their belief in virtue, romance, and the possibility of happiness in marriage, belief that these readers, whether or not they were living it, must have keenly felt as real, vital, and operative. Present-day research on reading and reading socialization supports my speculation on the effects of reading on and motivations of historical readers. Christoph Klimt and Peter Forderer, for example, underline the critical effects of reading, pointing out its ability to, quote, shut out quotidian worries, improve one's mood, summon a pleasant situation, and thus restore the well-being of body and psyche, end quote. Further, they confirm the role of reading in the expansion of affective experience, and thus to the development of empathy and connections to social networks and institutions, as Wayne Wiegand so beautifully argues in his study of libraries. German novels in American translation provided new stories and reinforced old ones about the happiness that marriage could bring. Of course, the Germany in these novels had never existed to begin with, and this German imaginary, liberal, optimistic, based in the regional hometown and founded in belief in marriage, is emotionally satisfying and socially beneficial, persisted in Imperial Germany only in attenuated form. While this American-created German brand reinforced ideas of Germany as the land of romance and sentiment, its long-term popularity and effects likely had to do more with Americans' management of their own affective lives through reading, foreign or otherwise. Unlike the later Disneyfied versions of Grimm's fairy tales, this German domestic fiction required no substantial American interventions in the plot, and that is the happy ending, to gratify American audiences. Indeed, they offered themselves in the 19th century to American translators and publishers pre-equipped with happy endings that allowed for redemption even of those who brutalized their own relatives. Thank you. And if I may, I'll just quickly show you some other things that, well, if we have time, we would love to look at some of these creations of Steve's, but you can see other ways of visualizing this information. Well, we'll just, no, we don't want to hold you up, but I'll just quickly show you that you can see that if you actually look at which groups had the most reading these books, or at least this one as a sample, it's 17-year-olds. So these are people in late adolescence, even though it spans the age, and the median age of the reader is a little bit higher than that. And what else have we got? There's some other ways you can sort of see the largeness of the title shows you the number of readers, and it gets ever smaller. And the German things come in about right there. Oops, I knew I was going to do that. And again, some other ideas of, so you can get an impression of that. And you saw this one on the paper that I handed in. So I'll stop right here. And as I said during the question period, if you would like to see some of these things interactive, then I'll ask Steve to step up and show you how some of these things work. They're great fun to play with, and you learn a lot just by moving the cursor around and looking at these titles. So thanks.
Thank you. Well, Jim has just put up the website. I wanted actually to begin by just picking up something that Christine said yesterday. You were asked why had you not digitized the records at Osage, Iowa, and I think your response was, well, I was too poor to do that. And I just think it's appropriate that, particularly whilst Jane Aiken is here, that we also thank the National Endowment for Humanities, not just for this conference, but without your financial help there, we would have been too poor to have completed this database and do the work. So please join me in thanking. My paper, I'm just going to take parts of it, but I began with a definition. I went to the Oxford Dictionary to look at Cosmopolitan, and you'll have seen from reading the paper, those of you who have read it, that the definitions as an adjective belonging to all parts of the world, not restricted to any one country or its inhabitants, having the characteristics, the second definition, which arise from or are suited to a range of many different countries, free from national limitations or attachments. And then it goes on to cosmopolitanism, and just says adherence to cosmopolitan principles, which really doesn't help terribly much. And in Soviet usage, disparagement of Russian traditions and culture equated with disloyalty. So we seem to be moving quite a long way from that. And I think, this I'm perhaps putting myself a little bit on the line here, because I think we've been skirting the question and addressing it directly through Joan Shelley-Rubin's wonderful paper. And I think the definition that you came out with was looking at a discourse which places the metropolis and the provincial alongside one another. But I think you were also acknowledging, which I have to do as well, the sheer slipperiness of the term and the difficulty of trying to work out what it means. And when I was thinking about the paper, I wanted to put together things which we have in the book that we're putting together. But I also thought, well, when did I first think about cosmopolitan and what that means? And it was when I was in Geneva, a young professor with my first job there. And I think, I don't want to go through that again, but I think the point I wanted to make was that Geneva seemed to succeed more as an international than necessarily a cosmopolitan city. So it sowed the seeds of thinking about what cosmopolitanism might mean and what the cosmopolitan is, and if indeed one can relate the adjective and the noun. If we transition to Muncie, it's perhaps the dilemma of a small city to find itself torn between a desire to compete with its urban rivals, against which it's likely, or at least risks being belittled, and a counter tendency to glorify its provincial roots and endangered rural character. And I think the crucial invention that sustained Muncie in the years subsequent to the natural gas boom of the late 1880s and the 1890s was the motor car. And I cited a poem by a Muncie doctor who wrote a volume of his thoughts, including some of his poems. And I'm not going to read the whole poem, but there's one point where he says, there was time in the 1890s, he's writing about the 90s, there was time to laugh and play when the honk of the Ford was not. And the poem acknowledges the inevitability of progress, while simultaneously, I think, ruining the loss of a slower and less developed pace that's denoted audibly by the clatter of horses' feet, which he talks about as against the honk of the Ford. And with poetical hindsight, the 1890s are made to encapsulate that transition from an era that measured itself by the gaiety associated with simple country pleasures to a more complex and perhaps more cosmopolitan milieu and lifestyle that lay in store with the advent of a new century, and perhaps was affected by comparison with other much larger cities. I'm sure Paris was one of them. And unlike the nostalgia in Cowing's verses for an older, more leisured way of life, the more common response is one that hails technological advancement and the putative advancement of cosmopolitan values, whatever those might be. And I think one can see that in a piece that one of the editors of a Muncie newspaper wrote, again in the 1890s, in 1893, in the Muncie Morning News, where he talks about the library, and he extols it as the pride of our city, the chief of our educational aids in support of the work being done by the public schools. And in an extended defense of books and of studious reading, this is what he says, and I'm not going to read the whole, but just parts of it. The best index to the intelligence, culture, and business ability of a community may be found in the quantity and quality of books its public, private, and professional libraries contains. Books preserve and make permanent the reason, law, and philosophies of the ages, give us historical inferences by which to construct our sciences and elevate our nation to a higher and better civilization. A library, he says, is an emporium of arts, the only veritable paradise in the material construction of man. It may be said of him who fails to enjoy a good book occasionally that he lives a semi-barbaric life in which reason is cruelly formed, misguiding conceptions prescribing to his happiness and deportment, thus dispelling the basis of a philanthropic life of usefulness and instituting in its stead a mind that becomes a narrow receptacle for the legendary riffraffs and hearsays gleaned from the lower currents of the world's ideals. Well, the high-mindedness and quasi-Jeffersonian rhetoric of these paragraphs, I think, deserves some unpacking. Books are seen by him as the key to self-improvement. The edification to be gained from reading and study is interpreted here as the primary means by which the people of America at large, and those of Muncie in particular, may be recovered from their putative semi-barbaric state and elevated to a higher and better civilization. Implicit here is the belief that through the life experience and the accumulated knowledge and insights that are recorded in books, we come out much better equipped to lead useful and socially meaningful lives. Without that knowledge and experience, it's alleged that the pursuit of human happiness risks becoming very disorderly and potentially retrogressive. The projection of the article then is upbeat in its emphasis on the role of the library as a kind of guiding light or leading indicator of the cultural ethos of a community. And the memorable delineation of a library as the only veritable paradise in the material construction of man may strike us today as unrealistic, even a little bit highfalutin, but it accords well with contemporary understanding that ties cosmopolitan aspirations and with the material and intellectual advancement of Eurocentric ideas of civilization. And it's interesting that the historian of Muncie at that time, who was a member of the library, he was president of the library for a while, Dr. G.W.H. Kemper, in his 20th century history of Delaware County, Indiana, calls it the 20th century history, but it was written in 1908, so it really records the early history of Muncie. He uses the work, and this is one of the wonderful things about Google Books, that you can look for keywords. So I was able to find Cosmopolitan a couple of times there. And he talks about this modern age when men are becoming more cosmopolitan in their conditions, when provincialism and the influence of state and selection are less plainly impressed on individuals. And that seems to be very close to Joan's interpretation in her paper yesterday. But what you have also is a second view which suggests that cosmopolitan is a way in which people from diverse backgrounds, and I think he's thinking about the period immediately after the Civil War. He himself was a Civil War veteran. Those settlers in Delaware County were perhaps as cosmopolitan as those of any county in the Midwest. Here were united in society and often in family ties, family ties, those whose lives had been molded by Puritan New England and those who had no influence and custom outside of Cavalier Virginia, and so on. He goes on to talk about that. And it seems to me what emerges is a complementary definition of the cosmopolitan that stresses notion of commonality and sees the inhabitants of Delaware County as representative of an emergent nation that's made up of largely diverse elements that can be annealed into unity in the Midwest. And I think it should also be pointed out, and perhaps that'll come out in our discussion, that Kemper is not talking about what nowadays would be deemed as multiculturalism, because the origin of all the people he has in mind is European. In a recent and well-known study, Margaret Jacob defines cosmopolitanism in today's world as translating into a meaning closer to home, a way of living in our multi-ethnic towns and cities. But I think such a post-colonial definition is not really germane to the present context. Rather, the subtext to Kemper's use of cosmopolitan should be understood to refer to the American Midwest as a location or melting pot in which the warring factions of North and South that had divided America but 40 years before were able to live together and harmonize more easily than in the primary battleground states of the Civil War. And in that sense, the Midwest provides for Kemper, himself, as I say, a Union veteran, a model of the cosmopolitan ideal and a promising blueprint of the notion of America as a country that was strengthened by healing its earlier divisions through fostering a caucus of citizens from previously divergent and separate backgrounds. I go on, and I don't think there's going to be time in this short presentation to talk about publications and the fact that the primacy of New York as a publishing center, and then I go on to talk about newspapers and magazines. But I'd like to perhaps just turn, finally in this shorter presentation, to some of the blue-collar readers that were there. There's plenty of evidence from the transaction records of the library to show how well it could support the autodidactic bent of many blue-collar and low white-collar readers. And it could be argued that as patrons, they gave the Muncie Public Library its primary raison d'etre, though taking readership as a whole, their clientage and extensive borrowing record were far more the exception than being in any sense typical of library usage by the city's manual workforce. The library may have trumpeted the naked fact that its borrowing privileges constituted an amenity that was freely available to all the citizens of Muncie. But in truth, the number of working class readers in relation to the size of the population remained disappointingly few. Where too, in their idealism, the founders of the library saw it as an institution that would bring untold benefits and advantages to the community through the general diffusion of knowledge, as we saw in that newspaper report. It would be difficult to argue that becoming a patron was at any time an automatic pathway to socio-economic advancement. Rather, I think the main benefit of the library should be seen as cultural, educational, and pleasurable. I want to end by looking at one particular patron, and we could, if time permits later on, look at some of her records. And one of the reasons why I chose Rosa Burmaster was that she came from, I would say, a low white-collar background. Her dad in the 1900 census is described as a tinner, which I think means a tinsmith. Maybe somebody else can refine on that meaning. But it seems that it was a skilled blue-collar occupation. Both her parents hailed from Germany, and that was the other reason for choosing her, because I think it relates to what Lynne has told us. And looking at Rosa Burmester's habits of reading as represented by the what Middletown read records throws up a number of revealing particulars. She borrows, and perhaps that's characteristic of a first-generation child of Teutonic immigrants, she shows a fondness in her middle years for German authors in translation, and she reflects very much, those books translated by Annis Lee Wister that you talked about. It's also interesting that she is fairly traditional. She reads all the Elsie Dinsmore stories, but she also shows some unusualness in her choice of reading. She was the one reader that I found in all of the database who read pretty well everything of Thomas Carlyle, and that seemed remarkable in itself. And I also think it's interesting that after school and college, and she went all the way through, she qualified as an educator, and her career was first as a teacher in an elementary school and a Spanish teacher, and later principal of the Washington School here in Muncie. What I also found interesting was that she and her fellow graduates, those people who graduated in the same year from the high school, founded what they called the Tourist Club. And I think that belongs very much to our notion of cosmopolitanism. Between them, they met 425 times, or at least there are that number of letters which they're supposed to have written. The letters don't survive. But we can see from Rosa Burmester's borrowing and from the borrowing of other members of this club that from reading other things, Rosa Burmester never borrowed a travel book at all. But as soon as the Tourist Club was set up, they represented a substantial part of her borrowing. And it's a great example, I think, of somebody reaching out, and perhaps a good example of what we have talked about in terms of what cosmopolitanism might mean. Writing from a metropolitan perspective, the Princeton philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah warns that celebrations of the cosmopolitan can suggest an unpleasant posture of superiority toward the putative provincial. But as we've seen, late 19th century Muncie endeavored to project itself as a small city that near perfectly combined so many aspects of the rural and the urban. And in introducing his theme, Appiah argues well for a twofold definition of cosmopolitanism that encompasses the idea that we've got obligations to others, and that as citizens of the world, we take seriously the value not just of human life, but of particular human lives, that we reach a recognition that people are different, and there's much to be learned from our differences. In the context of the library, the board took very seriously its custodial obligations to the citizens of Muncie, both in terms of the choice of books that it deemed appropriate for them to be able to read, and in encouraging them to make best use of the institution. Whether regular use of the library helped to make its patrons citizens of the world in quite that way is a far more difficult thing to ascertain. And likely many individuals benefited from the presence of the library, but for many others, those who never ventured through its doors to browse its shelves, it was an institution that played no part in their everyday lives, and the What Middletown Read database can throw no direct light on their cultural habits, only of those who entered through its doors. However, for its users, what the Muncie Public Library provided was ready access to a range and variety of reading material that had been unavailable to prior generations. For the majority of patrons, the library offered what the British book historian Catherine Armstrong aptly dubbed as the positioning of the town and its readers in a global community of knowledge, and which, no less forcefully, the Lynnes described as a vicarious entry into other imagined kinds of living. Thank you.
All right, and I'd like to offer some comments that hopefully will suggest some potential conversations we can have during the discussion. And I'll try not to take too long doing this so that we can have a nicely extended conversation about these two fascinating papers, as well as the digital research that stands behind them. There are several different strands that I'm going to keep returning to, not in any particular order, so I'll just kind of put those out so that you can kind of organize them as we go through. Certainly cosmopolitanism, trying to theorize that term, figure out what is it that we mean when we're talking about cosmopolitanism, how does it relate to other terms that have been offered at this conference, as well as others that haven't come up yet that we might consider worldly, international, some of these other terms. I'm interested in the implications for literary history. I'm trained in an English department. I teach in an English department, and so I'm interested in teasing out some of the implications for understanding literature over the 19th into the 20th century that we might think about here. And I'm also interested in the implications for the digital humanities, something that has again, been in the background of these papers, but both of these papers and the projects they're connected to, I think, are really intriguing interventions in this still emergent field of the digital humanities, where there's a lot of contestation over definitions, over ownership, processes, all these kinds of things. So there's a lot we can talk about. Let me start getting into that by talking a bit about my own database project that Jim had alluded to earlier. I teach at a little college in a little town in Pennsylvania called Easton, that's on the PA-New Jersey border in the Lehigh Valley. And this was, among other things, the site for a library that began in 1811 called the Easton Library Company. This was a shareholding library on the model of the Library Company of Philadelphia, and started with 100 shares. So everybody who participated was either a subscriber or was somehow closely connected with a subscriber. And there are a few different qualities to this library, whose records I'm working on turning into a database right now, that I think speak to what these projects have been introducing us to. One of the things that really strikes me about this particular library and the location that it's in is that Easton was a very heavily German-speaking town. At the time of the Revolution in the 1770s, Easton was, the best estimates say, about 80% German-speaking. By the time the library opened, that percentage had dropped, but not by all that much. Among the founding board, the first president was a man named Christian Endres, who was the pastor of the Lutheran Church in town. Christian Hutter was another founding board member. He, 3 years before, had published the first ever bilingual newspaper in Easton. It was side-by-side, German and English. There are several other German-speaking families who were involved in setting this library up as well as sustaining it over the years. But one of the really striking things about the collection is that despite Christian Hutter, who was also a bookseller, bringing in German language texts that he directly imported from Leipzig, from Berlin, from some of these other towns, apart from those gifts, there is almost no German language material in the collection, aside from, say, sets of Pennsylvania laws. There is a very big fiction collection dominated by English and French authors, not German or American. This is also a library that has a lot of travel writing, covering just about every country that Americans were interested in reading about during the pre-Civil War era. There are a lot of biographies from many different places around the world, including 2 biographies of Muhammad, which are acquired very early in the library's history. And the absence, so that on the one hand, there is this far-reaching interest in connecting with the outside world in the acquisition and the circulation patterns I'm seeing here along the lines of what Frank has talked about. On the other hand, the German absence, not just German language, but also so much German in translation, is skipped over. You don't see very much of Goethe, Schiller. You certainly, this is too early to see Wister's translations showing up, but there is not very strong interest in this, despite the fact that as late as the 1830s, Easton has triple the number of students registered in public schools in German classes compared to Lancaster County, which is often thought of as the epicenter of the Pennsylvania Dutch culture. Dutch is in Deutsch. These are German speakers. And so there are not only many adult German speakers, but many children, thousands of children in the 1830s are being trained in German in the public schools. And yet the library is not reflecting that linguistic diversity that is such a major part of so many lives connected to the library. So what counts as cosmopolitan then? We tend to think of multilingualism as being a major benchmark of cosmopolitanism. What do you do with a library in a multilingual town that refuses to be multilingual? And what do you do with a town that is so interested in travel and interested in fiction that comes from other places, but is not interested in immersing itself into the language of those places? There are more titles, I think, in Latin than in any other non-English language in the collection. So I just want to put that out to further trouble some of these terms and to think of it, what kinds of different cosmopolitanisms may be happening within these very specific localities, both in time and in space. To turn to Lynne's paper for a few minutes to think about what some of the implications are that I might point to, I was fascinated how important translation is to the U.S. fiction market at this point. Certainly the Harpers with their Harper Select novel series had been involved in making the works of Alexandre Dumas and many other European authors available for quite some time. The Easton Library Company also subscribed heavily to the Select novel series. But to think about by the end of the century, as copyright laws have finally changed, translations are starting to fall under copyright to the authors, so original authors can retain those rights, which is a pretty novel thing in the late 1890s. At the same time, international copyright treaties finally start to shore up these demands for royalties that people at Dickens, Thackeray had been making for decades and that Americans had scoffed at. Now suddenly there seems to be a more equal playing field. Despite that happening, these European translations continue to play a very important role in what people are reading. It isn't that after those treaties are passed, Americans just start reading American because now the Brits and other Europeans aren't cheap anymore. There's a definite holdover. And I think it's significant that, as Lynne points out, so many of these works are also from that pre-treaty era, that these are holdovers from earlier times. And the idea that Worcester would become such an important authorial figure I also found fascinating here. My main area of research is in American poetry. And one of the things I found in the very early post-war years following the Civil War, one of the things that Ticknor and Fields does to try to shore up the idea of an American literature that can now stand on the world stage, they publish a series of translations by top-shelf authors. Bryant translates both the Iliad and the Odyssey. Longfellow translates Dante, the first American translation of that of the Divine Comedy. Christopher Purse Cranch, member of the Transcendentalist Circle, translates Virgil, and Bayard Taylor, who, by the way, makes his reputation on travel literature, translates Goethe's Faust. And so these all come out in the late 1860s, early 1870s. So Worcester, in some ways, is riding this wave of translation as a newly prestigious form of authorship in America. In fact, I still have only been able to find one example of this, but I'm wondering if there are other examples around of the translator's portrait appearing as the frontispiece. This shows up in the Houghton Mifflin's Riverside edition of Dante's Divine Comedy, where a marble bust of Longfellow is the frontispiece to the work. So the translator, rather than the author, is the celebrated figure whose face welcomes the reader into the text. There's something about the figure of the translator during this era that's usually thought of as an era obsessed with originality. That I find really curious, and I wonder that's something we may pick up in further discussion. I was also very much struck by the the kind of dark side of cosmopolitanism that Lynne highlights here, starting with her title, The Traffic in Happy Endings, alluding both to Gail Rubin's The Traffic in Women from the 1970s, as well as more recent Meredith McGill's collection on transatlantic poetry reception, The Traffic in Poems. So thinking about this idea of traffic as having both the sense of you're meeting across some sort of space, but also on what terms are you meeting? Is this really a good kind of commerce that we want to see? The difference between using commerce and using traffic to talk about this has some interesting connotations to it. This idea of that reading these international spaces is an act of wish fulfillment. It's not necessarily a matter of bettering yourself so much as being able to escape where you are and go to this imagined space that eventually reality does destroy in the wake of World War I and these new ideas of what it means to be German. There's a fragility to this kind of virtual travel, and I want to talk about that term in a few minutes, the virtual travel that's going on in both these papers. Lynne's project, I think, also speaks eloquently to the buying and the reading power of women during this era. I think, an interesting counterpoint to Joel's paper yesterday about crossover reading, thinking about how specific populations do wield some sort of economic, cultural power at this point, even as crossover reading, as he effectively showed yesterday, does also drive a lot of what's going on. How do we keep both of these in play at the same time, that women as a group do have this force in the literary market at the same time that women as a group, men as a group, boys as a group, girls as a group seem to be mattering a bit less than they had even a few years before this. And then I also want to return to this in a few minutes, but the use of computer-aided and especially visualization kinds of techniques. Is this also a cosmopolitan gesture that's being made here? And I think particularly as this mode of literary analysis, particularly even more so than historical analysis, has the stamp of Franco Moretti on it, for better or for worse, at this point. How that his kind of cosmopolitanism is something that we have to address in some way or other. And again, I'll return to that in just a couple of moments. Taking a look at Frank's study for a moment, this tension between the cosmopolitan and the international, the idea, can Muncie somehow be more cosmopolitan than Geneva, is a really intriguing idea. And I very much enjoy that this is done not just through the means of these digital methods, but also harking back to one of these, to some people halcyon days, to other people possible not so halcyon, in the 1990s, this wave of what was called confessional criticism, where the scholar's own life helps to explain the literature that the scholar is working with. I think in some ways, as Leah Price has argued, this is something that everybody does at some level, but we tend to hide that more, and I really enjoy that Frank puts that more forward to say, well, when I think of cosmopolitanism, I think of these years as a professor in Geneva. It leads me to think about growing up in California and thinking that what people mean when they talk about cosmopolitanism, especially as I went into graduate school and encountered the works of Pascal Casanova, that somehow cosmopolitan means somebody who is at home only in New York and Paris, and if they have to, also London. Seeing a member of my grad cohort move back to New York because his girlfriend couldn't stand him being in a place as small as San Francisco. The second most densely populated city in the country, by the way. But it's that dense because it's locked within a 7-mile grid at the tip of the peninsula. There's this sense that where you're from really has a lot to do with what you think cosmopolitanism is and what the terms are. So I really applaud Frank for bringing that forward, even as he's also bringing forward the sources of the books that are being read in Muncie, how dominant New York is, and how D.C., the nation's capital, plays a role in acquisitions, though not nearly as much he shows in circulation, as it becomes a repository for government printing office documents, but nobody's really interested in reading them. And one thing that got me thinking about is how much certain cities wind up attaching to certain genres, that you get one type of reading out of one city, you get another type out of another city, so that, yes, New York dominates the publishing world in certain terms, but how much are those terms dictated by the kinds of fiction, for instance, that will sell? And how does that compare, say, to Lippincott, which is a Philadelphia firm? How much of a toehold does Lippincott still have? When I'm looking at the Easton Library Company, for instance, almost all the work they buy is from Philadelphia, if it's not imported. Even when there is a New York printing available of something, they will usually go with the Philadelphia printing of a work, from what I can determine. So how does that hegemony play it? When does it happen, and in what terms does it happen at this point? Also, this idea that reading can expand your horizons, particularly for working class readers. It sometimes does, but not in every case. The most striking example of this I found in that tourist club, this idea that you expand your horizons through virtual travel. I was recently reading a book by a scholar of Victorian literature named Alison Byerly, who has a book called Are We There Yet? Virtual Travel in Victorian Realism, in which he argues that part of what fiction writers are trying to do in the 19th century is to recreate the panorama, recreate some of these immersive virtual experiences. 'Cause we tend to now think of panorama, and I think this is the way that Lara was deploying this term, as a large vista, thinking of, say, panoramic settings on a digital camera, that it lets you see a whole lot of things at once. In the 19th century, that tends to connote not just seeing a lot of things at once, but you're actually in this place. You are not just seeing Jerusalem, you are in Jerusalem. You're not just seeing Pickett's Charge, you're standing in the middle of Pickett's Charge. And so these 360-degree panoramas, what by the 1880s, 1890s are generally known as cycloramas in the States, really give you this sense that you are being placed somewhere. And this is what fiction writers and travel writers are both trying to do. Not just to tell you, this is what it looks like when you're here, but you stand on this corner and you look around and this person passes you, and then you notice the flicker of the gas flame, and all these other kinds of motifs are there to actually bring you into that space. And it's understood to be virtual, but part of the success of that writing, as well as the visual forms that it's riffing on, is to get you to buy into the illusion, to suspend your disbelief so that for a brief afternoon you can be in Jerusalem, or you can be in Turkey, you can be in Rome, you can be wherever it is that a certain work is meant to take you. And so that idea of virtual travel as a kind of immersive experience that has everything to do with the place you're going to and virtually nothing to do with the place you're actually in, is another interesting way that we can tweak this idea of cosmopolitanism, that it really does take you out of Muncie or Easton or any of these other locations, and you're suddenly temporarily dropped somewhere else. One other thing I was very much struck by, especially in light of the Zbore's presentation yesterday, is also how this reading shows that print continues, as Peter Stallerbras has argued, to facilitate and proliferate manuscript. That print doesn't do away with manuscript, but it actually makes you write more the more print that you have, so that people are reading books of travel in the Muncie Public Library so that they can then sit down and write a letter using the print that they have just consumed to explain what it's like to be in a certain place in the world. So that issue of modalities I was also struck with. So now to combine these a bit and think about how we might think of connections and points of fruitful tension here. We certainly get these competing notions of cosmopolitanism, whether that is seen as more redemptive or whether that's seen as something that takes you away from reality in some potentially damaging or at least limiting way. Is cosmopolitanism merely a fiction that, like the old New Yorker map, that there is Brooklyn, there's something on the other side of the river, and that we don't really know what else is there? Is there that sense that when you go to Germany to live the good married life in these novels, have you somehow lost what's going on in Muncie at that point? So that that's something that I think, again, this idea of virtuality can really cut both ways. Also, these notions, these circuits that are moving around, not just in terms of where people are imagining themselves, but also where these materials are coming from. These books are winding up in Muncie via Philadelphia, coming out of Germany, in other cases New York, but some of those works are possibly coming from Paris, coming from Italy, coming from many of these other locations around the world. How are these places serving as conduits that connect Muncie to these far-flung places in the world in actually very material ways and not virtual, that these things are actually manufactured, they're authored in these far-flung places. I think these papers both very much also speak to the preponderance of European fiction. Again, bringing in some of what Joel was looking at yesterday, this combination of British and American authors, how dominant, again, European fiction writers still are for American readers. And this is where we start to get into the implications for literary history. Again, we tend to focus on production in literary history, but what about reception? What about the fact that people are still reading these works from England, from France, from Germany, at a time when the American realism movement is supposed to have taken over, that now, as Hamlin Garland said, we're writing about American topics, and so now we have somehow reached a point of maturity in American literature. I think it's significant that Mark Twain gets on the radar of American readers, not from his celebrated Jumping Frog collection, but from The Innocents Abroad, when he's writing about American experiences doing the grand tour around the Mediterranean. That this is really what people want to hear about. And it's only after that point that he can go back and write about life on the Mississippi. And even those works do not sell nearly as well during his lifetime as works like The Innocents Abroad do. So that there's something about that internationalism that has a very, very strong pull for American consumers, American readers, even very late in the century. Some other implications for literary history, I think both of these papers help to balance the notion of production as driving literary history with balancing this idea of reception. It's not that we need to look at one to the expense of the other, but how can we start to look at these in combination with each other? And I think Wister's example is a wonderful example where this is very much a story of production, but it only gets to be a story of production if you can find the readers showing, again, why this matters. The reason why this matters seems to be the number of readers and the persistence of these readers in returning to these stories over and over and over again. The case of Jane Eyre, I think, is another really key fact here. So much of this literature is predicated on Jane Eyre, even after Jane Eyre itself has fallen out of favor with American readers, that people still want to keep reading works like Jane Eyre. That you create these spheres of influence around these books so that it's not just that certain authors dominate the market, but those authors set genres in motion. They set certain habits of reading in motion that other authors, translators, editors will pick up and cycle back to the readership in this feedback loop that keeps works like Jane Eyre relevant, even if people are not reading that particular work. And so I think that this might present a new model for what it means to track an author's or a book's influence during this time. The book itself can go off the radar to some extent and still have a very strong power in the market, as well as in the canon. And I think the last thing that I want to point out here is that both these papers speaking to the enduring popularity and really overlooked popularity of travel writing. Again, people like Bayard Taylor make their reputation on travel writing. Even Longfellow builds some of his early readership through works like Hyperion, where he's writing about his European travels, which he was on to learn the languages he used as a professor of modern languages at various colleges. Americans ate up this travel writing faster than almost any other genre, and that includes fiction, I think, to a decent extent. So how this world of travel writing, which is seen both as very saleable, but also as something of a prestige genre during this time. Again, Twain tries to move his way up the ladder from being a local color writer to being a travel writer. That's the thing that really makes his breakthrough happen. Or even someone like Henry James, who has to leave the country and write outside the country to get attention after his would-be career as an American melodramatist has failed. That he turns to Europe to make his reputation. And the very last thing that I want to toss out has, again, to do with this issue of digital humanities and how both of these papers are wrestling with how to contextualize the digital humanities within what we already do. So again, going back to, you don't just drop production to talk about reception, you don't drop close reading and archival research to do the digital stuff. So how are these put in conversation with each other? And how is process foregrounded is something that especially I hope Lynne and Steve will talk about with these basket analysis graphs with some of the other work that you've done, but also I think very much, Frank, your work is very much informed by articulating process. I think this might be another dimension of, again, that confessional criticism impulse may come from this sense that realizing how much process matters when you're dealing with these kinds of digital projects in ways that literary arguments, and I think to a large extent also historical arguments, tend to really push into the background. Don't think about how I found this in the archives. I just happen to have this wonderful data that I can share with you. Digital humanities seems to start to strip that away, and I think that's part of what is also a helpful departure from, say, the work of someone like Franco Moretti. When Moretti in Graphs, Maps, Trees puts these graphs forward, he puts them forward as a literary critic. Here's this graph, and here's what it means, without talking about how you came up with the numbers that fed that graph, or talking about what is the methodology by which you chose these scales to put this graph together. And so I think in some ways both of these projects are moving in some meaningful way toward trying to make this process more visible and more accountable in a way that we can start to find a vocabulary for talking about, even if we are not trained in the digital humanities. We can find ways of talking about this. And so I'll step back at this point and turn it over to our panelists and then to the room.
Whichever, yes. Well, thank you very much, and I did appreciate pretty well everything that you that you said, and I think that notion that you described of being taken out of one's environment, whether it's Easton or whether it's Muncie, I mean, I think is a great part of reading, and you can certainly see that as representing a form of virtual travel even before the age of the internet. There were several things that I wanted to also raise. One was that you talked about the dark side of cosmopolitanism, and I think it's right to raise that. But as the more positive side of cosmopolitanism, you talked about multilingualism, and certainly I hadn't mentioned it. But I do think that in that context, when one talks about multilingualism, one should not forget the effect of the Tower of Babel. That sometimes it's going to have a negativity to it. The other thing which I think is interesting, that notion that you talked about of setting genre in motion, and I want to suggest one other thing to Lynne, or ask her about it. One of the works that you refer to, obviously not a German work, is Robinson Crusoe, which was extremely popular. But you didn't talk about the fact that there was a German version of it, that Swiss Family Robinson appeared and was translated into English, and was also extremely popular in Muncie and in the Midwest in America generally. Still remains that probably. But there are also, one of the things that I think is very interesting, if one looks at the What Middletown Read database and looks up Robinson and Crusoe and so on, you'll find that there are 3 or 4 other works which make use of that particular tale. And you might say that is an example of extreme travel, is it not? That the notion of being incarcerated on a desert island. And perhaps we could say that in our act of reading, if locking ourselves in a room, if it's a single reader, you are creating for a short time a similar version of that island. You're delighting in it.
Okay, I'll make two quick comments and then hope that other people have a chance to ask some questions. First of all, to the Robinson Crusoe, it was one of the big works from the German territories that made it to the States, but it didn't really, wasn't part of my particular project. There was a whole raft of Robinson Crusoe knockoffs called Robinsonaden that were circulated in the 18th century and continue to circulate to this day. So that was a good point. And along those same lines about this, the business of adaptation and reading internationally, it's very complicated. So what Germans might have been reading most in the 19th century would not necessarily have been German works, so they would have been reading some of the ones that I'm talking about, but it might have been Dumas and other people you've forgotten about, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, there is this sort of international reading that goes on in translation that we tend to forget about when we write literary history. And the business of translation, just a quick comment on gender. Wister was the sister of some very famous men, Horace Howard Furness, who's the Shakespeare editor, and the sister of Frank Furness, who's a fancy architect from Philadelphia. And in the very few letters that do exist, she's sort of embarrassed about what she's translating because it's not high literature. She's very acutely aware of that because she's from a very educated family, good friends with Emerson and so forth and so on. And yet, she works really hard on these things, so she does 2 or 3 a year. There was no reason to do this except that she must have gotten extremely invested in them. But when a fan asks for her portrait, she writes back and says, basically, why would you want this? I don't have a portrait, but you can have my autograph. The translation of this kind of work by women, in her particular case, when she has an author status, it's a product of the publisher and circulation, and not like Longfellow, who might put himself forward as, you know, a leading light of the new American culture or whatever. And there's a long tradition of men translating from the classics as a part of a move to develop a national literature. You can see it in the same sort of thing in the 17th century in Germany, when translation is high cultural labor. And what Wister feels she's doing, you know, who knows? It's a way of at least being sort of somewhere involved in this whole business of publishing, et cetera, but she knows it's not the same thing. So.
Thank you so much for those papers. I have one question for Lynne and one for you, Steve, if you don't mind. Lynne, I was just wondering, you know, Pat was talking yesterday about double consciousness, and I was thinking about whether that you have any evidence of German reception of Americans' reading of these novels, you know, whether there was any kind of reception in Germany of them being presented in this way to the American public.
Well, one of the things you see is complaints by the magazines, so both the Deutsche Romanzeitung and the Gartenlaube, who note that there's this thing going on, among other places, Philadelphia, and they're pirating the books and not paying them anything. And of course, they didn't have to because there was no enforceable copyright law. So they're sort of aware of it. So I found some things. And with another author whom I don't treat in this paper named Mühlbach, she was probably, I think you came up with some evidence of her in the Osage Library. But in any case, there you see it occasionally, and there finally the publisher is able to sort of assert make Appleton pay something. So it tends to be the magazines and the publishers kind of watching out for their own interests, and then you may find it some other places. Most of these women writers, though, if they're acknowledged in the culture of review in Germany, they're sort of sneered at, even though everyone loves them and everyone is reading them, and they're just knocking all the male authors, you know, out of the market. They're just not sort of what the male pundits think people should be doing in creating German literature. So I hope that sort of answers your question.
And Steve, I was wondering if you could explain to us a bit about the market basket affinity analysis and how you did that and what that means.
You wanna?
Yeah, market basket affinity analysis or market basket analysis describes, I think, names it well. It's basically observation people made in retailing, that when people buy one thing, they tend to buy another. They buy, you know, they buy diapers, they're probably going to buy beer, is the sort of classic example. So the trick is as simple as how many people read, say, for example, Horatio Alger, how many people read Louisa May Alcott, how many people read both, and if that number of people who read both is above a certain threshold, I simply say, well, those two books go together in the market basket.
Is it a kind of collaborative filtering sort of situation, or it's not, the kind of Amazon thing, people who read this were also more likely to read this? Is that?
You can understand it that way.
Yeah.
You can understand it that way. I think the Amazon thing is probably based on actual purchase history, browsing history, and subject headings. Whenever I go in and look at that in Amazon, I always think that's what they're showing me is more than just what goes together. Sure. Then I don't know how much more to say about it. The visualization's not. A lot of people have problems with this visualization. Visualizations are not always instantly transparent. This visualization, which does show the sort of general way the young men, I think this is probably the young women in this sort of broad group, how they read. But still, this is not a completely foolproof visualization. The circle, I'm pointing at the wrong thing. The size of the circles is sort of generally, a bigger circle means somebody generally was read more than a smaller circle, but it's not absolute. Otherwise, the Alcott, circle wouldn't fit on the page, or the Alger. The distances between nodes isn't really meaningful. Things that get read together tend to get pulled together in this graph, but the distance isn't really. So the visualizations are always, they never are really any easier to read than the raw data is. They're just a lot more fun to look at and click on.
No, I don't think that's true. Because I didn't create any of this, but when I looked at that, I understood better immediately because of the clustering, and I didn't need it in a minute way. I need it in a very rough and general way to help me start thinking about it. So it didn't bother me, Steve.
The other thing is we talk a lot about exposing our methods, and I do have some web pages up from when I was at Ball State last year that talk about my methods. I try to be transparent about that. Another thing that we would like to be able to do, though, is to be able to look for the same set of facts twice in different ways and see if they show up. So here we see this grouping of readers, Alger readers, Alcott readers, and adult women readers. And if I go and look at a much simpler visualization where all I'm looking at is, is it more male or more female, younger, older, I get sort of the same grouping that I got in my market basket analysis, which says that, maybe neither one is, maybe I'm right.
So you would get obviously different results and you can do that to find, shall we say, boys under the age of 16,
right.
Girls under the age of 16.
Yeah.
So you could refine it in
right.
a number of ways.
Right. If you're interested in this work, corner me over lunch, and I'll give you my card and put you in touch, or show you where via email where all of our materials are at on the internet.
Which program was that? What's this one, and which one did the network graph? This graph is drawn by a generic off-the-shelf, freely available, I think JQ plot. It's a standard thing. The market basket stuff is wherever that went is. Oh, I'll never find it now.
Second from the right.
Okay, yeah, it's custom written. I wrote not a lot of code to sort of build the edges and nodes that go together, and then
some embarrassing stuff. I know you use Gephi, which is a network.
I've used
yeah.
Gephi. The reason I ask is, so I do network analysis also of citational references. And Gephi is I imagine some of you have used it, but it's a free online program. The trick with Gephi, though, you realize how easily manipulable the data becomes, because the three classes that you've developed here, Gephi calls them modularity classes, and you can ask the program to find however many groups you want to find. So, if you want, if 3 works for certain kinds of for seeing certain kinds of things, but you could also say, well, give me 10. Sure. And it will split it out in different ways. So I find it an extremely useful heuristic, but then it does require a lot of interpretation along the way. All sorts of questions is what's a node, what's the edge going to be, what's the node going to be. So there's lots of choices. And Gephi is kind of curious because Gephi, I have a data set of about 10,000 points now. And because the algorithm is so complex, every time you run it, you end up with a different answer. And the graph never looks the same twice. So if you don't like the way the graph looks once, just run it again, and maybe it'll give you the thing you want. Which for me is interesting.
That happens without changing any of the data?
The data stays the same. The graph is always different. Always different. Which leads, Bruno Latour in his latest work is pushing network theory and resisting graphs, which his argument is that it's a static visualization of something that is always open-ended and in motion. And the only reason it's interesting is because more work can be done in forging different kinds of connections.
Can I raise one other thing? Which is, several people have asked me, well, are you teaching what Middletown read? And might be just useful to have a word or two about the pedagogic aspects. And one or two students who've taken my class are here. Jim and I did an introduction to the What Middletown Read database, and then I just gave a series of questions. I gave resources, which includes, and I've got copies of this, you can pass that around. I gave the various main sources that one might turn to, including Steve's wonderful source from Washington University, and then a number of exercises where we were looking at individual patrons, but then also at books and authors. The last time I ran this book history class, we didn't have the database, so this was the first time, and it's probably a fairly primitive type of exercise. I mean, my students might be able to comment on how primitive or otherwise, but I think we, emerging out of this was a very fascinating discussion as students were able to talk about what they had found and what they looked at, and it was a nice way of introducing them to a particular kind of research which we're doing. So I just pass it around in case there are any comments.
This is a civic institution that existed in the last decade of the 19th century.
Yes.
There were influences, external influences, applied to this civic institution. I want to just probe that a little bit. This same decade saw agencies called library commissions established across the Midwest. Indiana had one, Wisconsin had one, Illinois had one, Iowa had one. Across the Midwest, these were established by state legislatures, given some funding to promote public libraries. And now this comes to the Muncie situation. In my study of the Rhinelander Public Library, Upper Wisconsin, the public library refused to collect foreign language materials. Instead, what it got was German books for the German population there, Polish books for the Polish population, etc., from the Wisconsin Free Library Commission. And I remember vividly the director of that particular unit of the Wisconsin Free Library Commission, beautiful name, Ludi Stearns. complaining about the quality of the German fiction she was forced to send to Rhinelander, Wisconsin. Now, is there a pressure, do you know, on the Muncie Public Library from the Indiana Library Commission vis-a-vis quality of collections?
It seems that there's very little, although they did turn to the Indianapolis Public Library for the rules and regulations of the library itself. And they also went to, I don't know how it happened, but the Springfield, Ohio library was the other library which they...
Any idea whether there was a pressure when the good old girl retired and they brought in the grumpy old professional?
Oh, she changed everything.
Yeah.
Yes.
Was she, did the Indiana Library Commission advocate for her?
Yes. There were several people who, was it Merritt Hoagland, is it? Who was one of the...
America Hoagland.
Hoagland, yes.
Yeah, Electra Doran, Gracia Countryman, these
Yes.
are names of women.
She came to visit and was entertained at the Commercial Club, and there's a record of her experience, and she wrote about it as well.
Do you know whether the German language materials under her administration were no longer required?
That I don't know, because what I mean, this was just the transition to the new Carnegie Library, and one of the changes which this new grumpy professional librarian brought was that we should no longer keep records. So that's when the records end. So what we have are the records of the library that preceded the Carnegie Library. Would that we could compare precisely, what people were borrowing in the Carnegie Library, but she stopped that.
What's the name of the original librarian?
The original librarian was Hattie Patterson, and what's quite interesting there is that we found her correspondence with different, and I think that was something Beth Kroller, who's the librarian at the Carnegie Library, helped us to find these, and we've
She's the assistant director of the library.
and assistant director of the library, yes. So thank you. And I must say, I think, well, perhaps we've completed this work, but each time I go down to the Carnegie Library, Beth finds something else which we didn't know about, and it's been wonderfully valuable to have that. So thank you.
I have a quick thing I wanted to say. I didn't mention it in the paper, but in fact, many of these German translations from the German were actually cataloged as English fiction. So if you look at library catalogs, you'll see them listed there rather than under things German. If it was a place that had a large German population, sometimes they held them in both languages. And I was wondering if one of the complaints there was that the German fiction, it was the quality of the edition or the quality of the fiction, because George...
The happy endings.
Oh, the happy endings. Well,
Yes.
who would want those? But I do. That George Monroe, the Deutsche Library, had published all these things in the original German, and they were available on newsstands sort of everywhere in fairly cheap editions. So it was a sort of a complicated situation with the circulation of the things that had come from Germany. So it was there both in English translation and both being published in America in the German language in Fraktur. So.
Well, first of all, I loved both of these papers, and Lynn, I think you were particularly brave to raise the question why this matters. All of us need to think about why what we're doing matters. And as a historian, I think the kind of question that I would want to ask, though you can't really answer it from this material, is what the particular appeal of happy endings was in the 1890s. In other words, let's not just assume some kind of timeless attraction here, but what can, and this too is a contribution of the history of the book, that is to, yes, alter our sense of literary history, but equally to illuminate our understanding of cultural tensions at particular moments in American life. So you know, when the Lynnes get that comment, well, there's too much bad news out there, or unhappiness, that, to me, that's not a sufficient explanation. So I'd want to know about things like pressure on the family, social unrest. I mean, this is a period of great turmoil, and not too far away from here, you know, in labor and so forth. So that's just something I wanted to put out there as a task that really all of us could
I think
about.
that's certainly fair. I think it's worth looking at the age of the people who are reading, who are sort of in late adolescence and maybe having to face life situations that aren't necessarily tied to greater historical events, but possibly. In the book, I think I would venture to say that some of the reading of this German material had to do with turmoil after the Civil War and certain things that they found there. There's, as I said, there's another sort of strand of this, which is historical fiction. That's Frederick the Great and so forth, and somehow the family, the royal family, always manages to resolve things, and you sort of see internecine warfare, the 7 Years' War, et cetera, how that's resolved, and it seems to me sort of escapist literature that could have been particularly appealing after the Civil War. So I sort of float that idea there, but I agree, there are many things that go into people requiring a happy ending at any given time. My thinking about the Muncie data, though, was that it might have to do with development, the particular life stage that the majority of these readers were in, with gender, so forth. And unfortunately, I can't answer the question, but I agree with you that it's important.
Awesome, great stuff. One of the questions that I sort of wrestle with, and I want to bring up, and Frank talks about this in the paper, but I don't think you really got a chance to talk about it in your comments, is that the histories of libraries that we write tend to privilege bound volumes, right? Either monographs, works of fiction, or bound older journals. And I'm curious how you deal with that, how you wrestle with that issue that libraries are sites of many forms of printed media, and that our reception needs to take into account that people read lots of different types of things. And this, in the work that I've done on dissenting academies, came home in two ways. One, at the Bristol Baptist Academy in the mid-19th century, the most borrowed title is the Edinburgh Review, right? It's a periodical more than anything else. I mean, by far and away, the most popular title. And even certain issues, if you sort of break down to that level, are more popular than the vast majority of books they could have read. The other piece of evidence is the inside cover of the borrowing register for Homerton Academy, where they have a chart where they pulled all the 20 different serials that they subscribe to, and then they list which student gets it in which order, down to, I think maybe it was Joan who talked about, or somebody who talked about the 15-minute rule, right, that you could only have a book for you have a newspaper for 15 minutes. How do you, I mean, what do we do with that type when we're writing these reception studies? Lynne, I'm not sure how, do you do German magazines and German periodicals and how that comes in? Frank, I don't know if there's more that you want to say about how that fits into our ideas of cosmopolitanism.
Well, it's interesting. First of all, just picking up something that Chris mentioned where you were talking about Lippincott, and this was a much shortened version of part of a chapter, and I do try to look at other cities than just New York, which I mentioned there, and Washington. So I think that that's one side. Now, with periodicals which came from those various cities, they were in the library very, very early on, and what Jim, I think, was able to find was that in many cases they were read before they were bound, you know, so that that whole question of collecting things. Newspapers, on the other hand, were ones which were received, and a decision was made after a certain while that there were too many of them. They didn't have the space. So the only ones that they kept were the Muncie newspapers. And Beth will probably be able to tell us, we do still have, I don't think complete runs, but we've got some early newspapers.
Papers on microfilm that were done by the state, whatever exists.
Yes.
We have a few of the original papers that were bound, my understanding, by the newspaper. And I still come across, like, a 1903 one just was found in a renovated building, a building that was being renovated, and we will be getting that next week. So we do have some 1800, early 1900 bound ones.
So you see what I mean about going down there each time and something new coming up.
Do you read the newspapers that they kept as reflecting the highest trafficked newspapers, or do you? I mean, how do we read intentionality? Into
Well, we've read across the newspapers. There are many gaps, so I mean, we've not read totally comprehensively, but I think what we were looking for specifically in the Muncie newspapers were references not just to the library, but to reading generally.
I mean, are you asking about local papers, or are you asking about papers brought in from other cities?
I'm asking about the decision to go from a lot to a little, and what was motivating that, and what we can read about.
Budget.
Yeah.
I
Okay,
mean,
so
chiefly
it's
budget, but
not-
some demand as well. I mean, a balancing of demand with resources. So.
All right, and with that, I think we will bring this conversation to a temporary close. Given the number of hands that were up, I think we'll have lots to talk about over lunch, but it's now time to not virtually but bodily remove ourselves to a new space. And thanks to our panelists.